Welcome back to the Changemaker Podcast. I'm your host, Deke Copenhaver. Today, my guest is Gloria Squitiro. Gloria has a bachelor's degree in psychology. She's a published author in Harper's Magazine and is the author of the best-selling May Cause Drowsiness and Blurred Vision, The Side Effects of Bravery, the first in the three-book Come On, Funk memoir series. She has been married to Mark Funkhouser for 40-plus long-ass years. Gloria's mission in life is to make every other man on earth grateful he's not married to her. I love that. In 2006, Gloria became Funk's campaign manager by default. She has the rare distinction of being the only first lady to be legally banned from the City Hall office where her husband was mayor. This is my favorite part. And usually, voice being bad, but I got to read them this. Good Morning America, Fox and Friends, NPR, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, USA Today, The Washington Post, even Great Britain's left-wing Guardian, and America's right-wing Rush Limbaugh, reported stories with her. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gloria.
Welcome to the Changemaker Podcast, hosted by Deke Copenhaver. Deke is the author of The Changemaker, a Forbes publishing book that has reached #1 on Amazon on multiple occasions and in multiple categories like management skills and total quality management. During this podcast, Deke interviews exceptional change-making leaders. Deke currently operates Copenhaver Consulting, where he helps local governments and other public organizations maximize their potential. He's also a sought-after public speaker. We hope that the Changemaker has an impact on you today and that you find takeaways that make you a better leader in your life. Now, here's Deke.
Hello, Mayor.
Hey, man, we've had to juggle times to get together, but I'm so psyched about this. So I want to get you, so you were the first lady of, your husband was mayor of?
Kansas City, Missouri.
Kansas City.
The 30th largest city in the United States.
Which is so cool, but you were his campaign manager. And I say this to say, people know I was mayor of Augusta for 9 years. But I've said, in my opinion, particularly with the crazy stuff we see in politics, local government is really where the rubber meets the road.
Yes.
Mayors matter now more than ever.
Yes.
So how did you become his campaign manager? What was it like being first lady of Kansas City? And how did you get banned from the local government offices?
All right. I hope I remember those 3 questions. You'll have to remind me. That's what happens. Menopause for women. You don't remember things. So how I became his campaign manager, it was complete delusion on my part, believing my husband. My husband has been a government servant at that time for over 30 years, first in state government, then in local government. And so just the complete goody two-shoe guy with the white hat, wanting to make government run for the people. And the media loved him. So he was constantly in the newspaper, on TV across the country. And so he felt like it wasn't proper for him to retain his position at City Hall and run for mayor, actively run for mayor,
Okay.
which to him meant not even looking for a campaign headquarters. So he asked me to find a campaign headquarters, and that was it. I'd go back to my life and do my thing, my own thing. Well, it took a long time to find a campaign headquarters because he's really cheap. And, I had to stay in a certain budget. So at any rate, I found an old broken down double wide trailer, fit the budget perfectly, wasn't too far from the house, and came home, said I was done, did my desk. And then he's like, well, what about the furniture? And so then I'm, turning on the lights, buying, computers and things like that. And one thing led to the other. And the day of his announcement in that trailer, I was supposed to leave that day, But the phones, I had ordered 6 lines, which was, I should have never done that. There's one volunteer there and me and Funk. That's my husband. And the phones, every line lit up. And how was I going to leave without all that going on? So I stayed to answer those phones.
So basically,
that day.
That sort of played into your husband's being a little cheap. You probably worked for free too.
My husband worked for free.
No, I'm saying you probably worked for free.
Totally. Yes. No. Yes. I did not make a dime.
I love hearing that about your husband feeling like he should step down from his city position. I'm like, there actually are still ethical politicians out there. I know some in the audience might not believe me, but I was on the board of the Georgia Municipal Association for 9 years. And there are people at the local level that are really, and it doesn't sound like your husband at all, they're not in it for a career in politics. They're in it to actually be a public servant.
Yes, that's so true. And what my husband still believes about city employees is that they just get no thanks, just the worst rap. And most of them are dedicated public servants as well, doing their job, wanting to do best for their city or county or whatever.
I always reminded our governing body that I'm like, look, we've got 3,000 employees, but the local government, this becomes the face of local government. So it's what, if we're on the 6 o'clock news every night, fussing and fighting and just making ourselves look like fools, that's what generally people think about the local government and the employees. But I agree with you. People asked me after I left office, they're like, well, do you miss politics? I said, I don't miss politics, but I miss the good people that I worked with every day for 9 years that were in it for the right reasons. And that's to provide a service to the public.
Yes. That's exactly the kind of mayor my husband was.
Well,
you guys are few and far between.
Well, but I think now, the perception of politics, it has become so polarized that people think that there's no hope. But I'm like, change can start at the local level if you have people that are particularly running for mayor for all the right reasons and setting the example, which is obviously what your husband did in Kansas City.
Well, I think he had not such a great run as you did. Kansas City is a deeply entrenched politics where the same council runs over and over and over again. They get elected. The citizens constantly are bitching about the government over and over again, and yet they elect the same people. And for my husband, 18 years in Kansas City, exalted by the newspaper and by the citizens. And yet, the people that didn't take him seriously about running for mayor, so they did nothing to try to stop him running, made sure he wasn't reelected. So he had a very short run compared to you.
And that is, I tell you, Gloria, that is what's so sad. So I was 37 years old.
Wow. That's young.
I flew under the radar screen. I was the only candidate to go into the general election with no endorsements whatsoever.
Yes.
So, but I campaigned relentlessly at the grassroots level. So nobody saw me coming, but then I didn't owe anything to anybody.
Yes.
I look back on it now and I'm 55 and I'm like, I know that the powers that be probably thought, who the hell does this guy think he is?
Yes.
But once I got in, they couldn't get me out, so they had to work with me. But that is so sad because we had a race last year. I campaigned hard and supported our new mayor, great guy. But I had somebody tell me, and I'd love to get your take on this. So somebody said, well, look, you need to run because if you ran again, you'd win in a landslide. And so that would have to translate to being better at governing. I'm like, no, because what I saw with our local elected body, I'm sure it's the same thing in Kansas City, is that winning in a landslide and having the support of the people stirs jealousy and envy. And you've got people that just want to work against you to make sure you fail.
Yes. In my husband's case, Kansas City was almost bankrupt the way of Detroit was when he took over, and it was because of TIF. I'm sure you know tax increment financing.
Tax increment financing.
Yes, and so that money, citizens' tax money, went to build buildings downtown that were absolutely unnecessary.
Yeah.
And it basically, so those people that had been getting wealthy off of the citizens' tax money did not like having one hand tied behind their back when my husband was mayor. Yeah. And so money talks, money affects people, and that's why they went after him so hard, is because he did, kind of turn that spigot off just a little bit.
Well, and that's the thing to me, is that if you're doing the right thing, like you said your husband was, came in with a white hat, he was ethical and stepped down from his city position, he is exactly the type candidate that the people want, but that type of candidate is a threat to the good old boy system.
That's right.
It is. And so if you're ethical, but I tell people that it was a good thing for me to be 37 years old and naive, but I was telling somebody about that. They said, you weren't naive, you just weren't jaded. Yeah. And so I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't know that there was this good old boy system and everything. I was just, but that is so entrenched and ingrained in so many cities, but people want people doing it for the right reasons. But when somebody does that, they're a threat to the status quo, which is so sad, because I wanted to be a candidate that people could get excited about supporting, which I'm sure they got excited about supporting your husband, but the powers that be didn't want him there.
He had immense support from the city and his campaign, so much that we couldn't really take all the volunteers. So tremendous support, and went into office with a 68% approval rating. It had never been seen before in Kansas City, that high of an approval rating. I thought that was terrible. I thought he should have had a 95% approval rating for the way the campaign went. Yeah. But I didn't know anything about politics. I actually am quite apolitical.
You and me both. So in Georgia, all local elections are nonpartisan. And so people have called me politically agnostic. But I'm like, okay, we're probably pretty evenly divided in Augusta. Democrats and Republicans may or may not be the same way in Kansas City. But I'm like, why would I alienate basically half of the people I serve by kowtowing to one party or another? Yes. So I personally think being apolitical is a good thing. And I was just talking to somebody about this other day. I'd love to get your take on this. I had a political science professor when I was in college. I was a political science major, that said, well, if you don't love politics, you shouldn't get involved. And I'm like, basically, particularly after serving for 9 years, I'm like, if you like backbiting, telling half-truths or lies about people, I don't think you're fit for a leadership position.
Yeah. That's a tough one. I think if my husband was more, my husband was a doer, right? He wanted to fix things, he did not he was very politically naive. Yeah. And I think that really worked against him. And so he's this do-gooder from the sticks of West Virginia. I'm a Long Island girl, Italian, immigrant, grandparents. And, I almost immediately saw what was happening in his first 3 months as mayor, and begged him to, when you're playing with evil, like evil's coming at you, the white hat is not going to do it for you.
Yeah.
The white hat is for the second term. Most people think that when you're elected mayor, it comes with power. And actually it does not. You have to grab the power back from the people that have it. And that's what we didn't do. Well, he didn't do. I counseled him to do that, but he didn't. He only lost by 1,126 votes. So he was gaining steam on his own, doing it his own way. But to me, you can't just be a white hat when you first take office, or he couldn't be, not in Kansas City.
Well, it's interesting. So my approval rating leaving office after 9 years, which I was term limited, was the gentleman that took my place polled, and it was 72%, right? So I won 3 elections with 64%, average of 64% of the vote by not being a typical politician.
Yes.
But you're right. I snuck in that first year. I had to run the next year because the first year I ran to fulfill an unexpired term. So I got 9 years, but once I got in, they couldn't get me out. But
that's amazing.
But but it shows me that in general, I'm like, if 72% of the people in Augusta, Georgia, a southern city with 200,000 people support a young, forward-thinking candidate, that's what the people want to see. Immediately after I took office, after 9 years, it reverted back to what it was before.
That's true.
Which is frustrating. But
yes.
I want to get your take on this because you talk about being apolitical. I've started to get very familiar with the Forward Party. So it's a national party that's trying to become a very viable third party. But they are trying to get on the ballot in all 50 states for next year's presidential election. Democrats and Republicans in every state are fighting against that. And I tell people it's because politics is about power and control. And so the two parties, they have a monopoly on the market. So do they really want a viable third party?
Yes, I agree. It is. Politics is about power and control. And yes.
Well, but God bless your husband for doing that to begin with. And, I think the more case studies that you can present of guys like Funk doing it in Kansas City, me doing it in Augusta, is that you can do it a different way. But I think part of the problem, and I want to get your take on this, that we have in every city is apathy. Because in general, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. And you're right, people complain about local government, then we keep sending the same people over and over again, and we expect change when it's like the definition of insanity is to continually do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I think, it would sound derogatory to say that people are apathetic, but the fact is that they are. But why are they apathetic?
Yeah.
And it's because so many politicians make promises.
Yeah.
They have a campaign agenda that they do not fulfill for many reasons. I mean, one is you have to know how to play the game of politics to get people to vote your way. You're not just, I actually think, I don't know if, I'm sure Joe Riley, is that his name, from Charleston?
He was a mentor of mine, is a dear friend.
Yes, that guy. We actually, Funk and I went to something in his city where he was, mentoring.
In Charleston, yeah.
Yes, and he was kind of like, Funk was so taken aback that this guy, in Funk's opinion, lied about, doing certain things in the government. So like there was a house that he wanted to renovate. and keep, instead of, it was scheduled to be bulldozed. And it shouldn't have been bulldozed. Joe Riley basically, is that his first name, Joe?
Yeah,
Am I
Joe.
saying it right?
Joe.
Okay. He basically was a one-man show in South Carolina for what, 30 years or more?
I think it was 26 or right at that.
Yeah. And that city went from nothing to something major. And I mean, so for Funk, he's a mayor and he's got 12 other council people.
Yeah.
And those council people are like puppets for the people who funded their campaigns.
Exactly.
Yes. And so for Joe Riley, being able to basically say, this is what we're going to do, and look at what happened with this city. I think it's a strong mayor form of government is much better. And then you don't like what the person's doing, vote her out.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'll tell you about our local government here in Augusta. We consolidated in 1996, I believe. So our municipal government was basically going bankrupt because they never wanted to raise taxes, but they were robbing from the water utility to cover deficits. So it forced a shotgun marriage to consolidate the city and the county governments. So it was a government that was founded on mistrust, continues to breed mistrust. But before that, we had a strong mayor form of government. But because they saw what potentially could happen with a strong mayor, they went with basically, we are not a strong mayor or strong manager. We're driven by our commission. They hire and fire department heads. So it's like 96 of municipal governments nationally are either strong mayor or strong manager. We fall in the category of other. And so I'm like, if you've got no centralized authority, there's no centralized accountability whatsoever.
Yes.
So I went on the board of our local development authority and just had a meeting with them this morning. But I said in Augusta, part of the problem that we have is we're district-based politics to where consolidation pitted every commissioner against each other in fighting for resources. It's like, well, if you do that for my district, I mean, for your district, I want it for mine.
Right.
But it's just, I think the mindset at the grassroots level has moved so far beyond that. And I just, but I hate to hear that your husband, somebody like that, offered themselves as a true public servant, but that the powers that be, that frankly, as you say, comes back to money and power. They're making money off of keeping the status quo in place. So him being an honest mayor took money out of their pockets. And that's just wrong, but it's real.
Yes, it's totally real. For him, my husband, we didn't realize that the media was part of that establishment.
Yeah.
So they can bring you up and they could take you down. And for 18 years, they talked about what an honest politician he was, because like you said before, the council was the person when he was a department head who voted on whether he'd get a raise or not.
Yeah.
And of course, our family never got a raise because Funk his job was to report about each department and is it doing what it was set up to do. And of course, you're going to critique it. And of course, that's going to get into the newspaper because the newspaper loves nothing more than to stir controversy.
Yeah.
And so the council actually hated my husband as a public servant, but the media loved him because of his honesty, his willingness to stand up to the council. It was unheard of to stand up to the council back then. And so this is in 2007, well, before 2007. But the minute he got into office, like I'm talking about, like within 20 minutes, the newspaper is wanting him to change his agenda. And that's when we realized that the newspaper strongly dictated how the direction of Kansas City, why they thought this guy would ever back down from his agenda, I have no idea. But they dismantled him.
Well, I want to get your take on this because it sounds like this is what you've experienced. What I've said oftentimes, I think in politics, I'm like, people, it's not, I think the people want leadership, which is what your husband provided, but the powers that be want somebody they can control. And so
Yes.
if you put somebody in there that's actually going to lead,
Yes.
going to call down, corruption or whatever it may be, that's not, people would rather have somebody that that's in their pocket than somebody that leads, because leaders, it's not about telling people what they want to hear. It's telling people what they need to hear. And it goes back to you. The knock against typical politicians is they make these promises. They tell people what they want to hear, which 9 times out of 10, they probably realize they can't deliver on those promises, but it casts everybody else that's in elected office in a bad light.
Yes, and that's where the apathy comes in, because here we have another person. They seem honest. They seem like they're going to do what they say, and then they don't do what they say.
Yeah.
In Funk's case, he had a very short term, but Kansas City at the time was the 3rd most violent city in the United States. And he reduced the crime rate by 33%. The citizens wanted more cops on the beat.
Yeah.
And the council had been trying forever to get more funding for the police department, which oddly enough was controlled by the state. Our city was controlled by the state.
Wow.
And so Funk was able to get the voters to vote on, I might be getting this wrong. The bottom line was that the council actually voted against more money for the police department. And it's only so that they can go against anything he wanted to do, they voted no on. And that's how they were trying. Well, that's how they did get him out. But I am so idealistic. I could not believe that they would put their own need to serve just for a title above the safety of Kansas City, the 3rd largest, the 3rd most violent city in the United States. And that's what they did. That blew my mind as an idealist.
Well, sometimes I tell people, I wish I didn't know as much as I know.
Yeah.
And I believe in local governments, but I've told people when they said last year, why don't you run? I'm like, being 37 and having no idea of what you're getting yourself into versus being 54 and having spent 9 years learning exactly what you're getting yourself into. It's 2 totally different things. But I think this is a good education for our listeners and our viewers. So I'll give you an example. Our new mayor, he grew up in an impoverished inner city neighborhood. He developed a wonderful local business, very profitable, great businessman, pulled himself up by his bootstraps. But people didn't expect him to win because there was another candidate that had been in local government for a long time, also a friend of mine, but I'm like, I want the businessman. I would prefer, goes back to the same thing. I'm like, if we're going to fix local government, let's not bring somebody in from the inside. Let's bring somebody in from the outside. But when he was elected unexpectedly a year ago, so a certain commissioner, council person, took him aside and said, you're going to know where I'm coming from on every issue because I'm going to be against you on every issue because I don't like you and I didn't want you here.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do you govern? You and I are, optimists and think rationally, but it's like, how do you deal in a situation like that? And I've shared with my friend going in, because I came from a business background. I'm like, I will tell you, as much as people say we're going to operate local government like a business, I'm like, it is not like running a business whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Yes. And what you said before is, I don't think a lot of people I wouldn't have known any of this had I not experienced it myself. But shortly after Funk was elected, there was a well-known campaign manager that typically followed the mayor into office. So that guy, his name was Steve Glorioso, Italian, was a fixture at City Hall and fed the media stories, right? It didn't matter that it was made up out of whole cloth, but he was overheard in a restaurant saying, "I am going to make Mark Funkhouser's life a living hell." And that guy set out to do that, and he did it. He made good on it. And the weird thing about it for us is that because Funk was so beloved by the citizens, the media really couldn't, after 18 years of putting him up on a pedestal, they really couldn't start saying nasty things about him. And that's why all the focus of the nastiness came down to me. Someone that had nothing to do with anything. And so they dismantled him through me. I mean, the things that they printed in the newspaper, like for instance, they got a hold of my computer and I had a journal in there just from a trip that my family took. And then I started keeping notes about the campaign just so I could remember it, mostly for my kids to have a keepsake, right? The media got a hold of what they thought was my diary, 400 pages, and they printed that in the newspaper. I couldn't believe that they thought it was something personal, a diary. There was no line that they weren't willing to cross to get somebody good for Kansas City out of office. My husband actually did reduce the crime rate there, even without the council support, by 33%. So that I don't even know how he did that, but in fact, he did it. And now it's back to what it was before. Like you said before, you get a guy goes out of office and then it's all unraveled. Like it doesn't, the forward momentum doesn't seem to keep going, which is a really weird thing. How do you ever change, if it just reverts back?
It's interesting to me in my discussions with the Forward Party. One thing they're very interested in doing is getting very involved at the local level. So they don't insist that somebody says, well, I've become a member of the Forward Party, and they do have people who identify themselves at the state and I think even national level, forward Democrats or forward Republicans. But they told me what they'd like to do is help, provide access to funding and to strategy for local candidates to run. I said, I think that's where you can really make a big difference because this gets us beyond what you're talking about. Because generally, I've focused on trying to recruit younger people to run in Augusta. And it's hard because, if you're, building a life for your family and children and you've got to have the time commitment, but plus it's oftentimes that, the powers that be are going to fund the candidate that they want in. So if you've got a young candidate offering themselves, but I said, if you could fund those young candidates and provide strategies for them, I think you could really start to make a difference at the local level. But I've also said, it's got to be safety comes in numbers. And when it's one-offs like me or like Funk, and fortunately I got some younger people to come in while I was in office, but until you get the safety of the numbers, it is difficult to change for the extended period of time. I mean, you can do it for a short period of time, which look at what your husband did with crime, but that good old boy system and that status quo is held in place by people that benefit off of it.
Yes.
Frankly, benefited off of it for probably generations.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I would have never believed it, but it's true.
Well, and I think too, so you were ruthlessly attacked,
Yes.
and but that's the thing to me too, is I think it's because I had people say, why would you want to get involved in all that?
Right.
And fortunately, my wife was never in the spotlight. She said from the beginning, I don't want anything having to do with that. She didn't get attacked. But even if she didn't, when I was unfairly, it's hard on your family, and I'm
Totally.
sure for your husband to see, his wife attacked in the media, that's just not easy to see people you love put through that crucible.
Yes. I had one journalist come to my house once, maybe halfway through Funk's term. And so she's supposed to be interviewing me for her newspaper. It was the local Hispanic newspaper. And so, I mean, they're supposed to stay, not friendly, right?
Yeah.
Like, so she at one point looked at me and said, do you realize that there's been 500 hit pieces written about you? And I said, absolutely not, because after the first month of Funk being in office, I had to stop reading all of that. You would not be able to go on, carry on, if you kept reading that stuff. On my 50th birthday, now it's hard enough to turn 50 for a woman anyways. But on my 50th birthday, there was actually 3 terrible things written about me on the opinion page of the local newspaper, the Kansas City Star. There was a terrible, ugly cartoon. There was an editorial, and there was a terrible letter to the editor. It was almost like it was done on purpose. We know it's her birthday. Let's ruin it for her. And it was hard on our family. It is a miracle that we survived financially, first of all. And then that Funk and I stayed intact maritally.
Oh my gosh. And I tell people that you talk about putting pressure on your marriage.
Yes.
Good gosh. But I'll tell you an experience that I had. So Facebook was not prevalent when I first ran in 2005,
Right.
but when it became big, and now we've got everything else that comes after. So a college student from Augusta started a fan page for me. So I'm like, I didn't know what Facebook was. So I'm like, well, that's a good way to communicate with my constituents. So, but what I realized was it gave an unrealistic concept of access. So I'm like, if you're hitting me up at 11:30 on a Saturday night about a public finance issue and you want me to give a long form answer, that's unrealistic. But so then my third campaign, I had a guy that was supporting another candidate. So he came and filmed my house and he was like, oh, this is the mayor's neighborhood. He lives in a nice neighborhood. This is not blighted. There are no homeless people here. It was creepy as hell.
Yes.
So I forwarded it on and I'm like, this is what I got to face. I subsequently got off of Facebook. But after I won that year, the guy posted on Facebook, I hope the mayor gets the flu and dies so that his candidate could be mayor. And I'm like, okay, but I broadcast that on Facebook because I'm like, understand anybody, the press can make caricatures of you or anybody.
Yes.
We're all human.
Yes.
And we've got feelings.
Yes.
And so it's just making caricatures, but I'm like, I want people to know this is what my family is having to go through for me to be a public servant.
Yes, that is so true. And for me, we ran a grassroots campaign too.
Yep.
I became Funk's campaign manager by default. And just from having read the book, The Campaign Manager, I don't know if you're familiar with that book by Catherine Shaw, but she basically gave a how-to run a campaign, and I followed what it said to do. But one of the things that Funk wanted me to do was to write a weekly newsletter during his campaign. And it did bring that connectivity between him and the constituents, and they loved it. And I did not I mean, I have a big personality. I did not water that down. I did not say, well, I didn't sit on the fence. I took a stand. Leadership is about leading, and most politicians do not. They sit on the fence and look to see which way the wind's going to blow. And that's why Funk wanted me to follow him into City Hall. He wanted me to continue writing that weekly newsletter now from the mayor's office. And that connection is so important for us. It was easy to win the campaign.
Yeah.
It was much more difficult to keep the support of those constituents with us, because they're believing what they're reading in the newspaper, even though it was a complete made-up scandal, one after the other, after the other, after the other. None of it was based in reality.
But I'll tell you, we face a new difficulty now. So I've been out of office 8+ years, but my meeting with our development authority, we were talking about some misinformation that I got out there but in front of an economic development deal. I'm like, you've got to stay ahead of the narrative. But our current chairman pointed out that our local paper is nothing what it was like when I was in office. And he said, I hate to say, I wish the Augusta Chronicle was back functioning that way. But so how do you get stories out to the general public, as a city and as a local government? But I did the same thing. I wrote a weekly news brief every Friday, pulled from the local news. And so then it expanded into YouTube video and then to almost a complete newsletter. But our local paper at one point said, well, why don't you publish that through us? And I said, no, because then it's not me speaking directly to the people, because you can editorialize me. So that directly, as you and Funk did, speaking directly to the people is important. It was then, but it's now more than ever, because you think, the coverage our local governments get as local media, we're not getting one of our local TV stations anymore locally. So the coverage of local government is going way, way down. Some might think that's a good thing in some ways. Some ways it might be, because you're not as much of a target. But how do people stay informed?
Yeah, that's the real conundrum, isn't it? But I think for any good person that is running for office, it is what you and Funk did. It's speaking directly to them, to the people, yourself. And I think the new politicians, the ones that aren't, the same old, they need to be schooled in how to retain a seat, in the government. So like you said before, there is, strength in numbers. If there's more of the goody two shoes sitting at the helm, that's what's going to create the change. It's not the one by ones. There's an education that needs to happen about how to retain your seat if you're not a regular politician.
Well, and I will tell you, so I wrote a best-selling book a couple of years ago, The Changemaker, The Art of Building Better Leaders, which is about leadership. But so many people thought, ex-politician, it's a book on politics, because they don't associate leadership and politics, which is sad. But I've wanted that to be a blueprint for the younger generation. So a mayor, one city over from us, used it to get elected, but it's so counterintuitive. So I was talking to our leadership with the Development Authority today. They were talking about how our permitting department is, in our plan review, they are so understaffed. So they've got one guy to review all the permits when we've got all these major businesses looking to come in. But, it's how do you accurately use your resources? But that's the thing. So I said, well, I voted to raise taxes. I broke a tie in 2014. It was the first time we had voted to raise taxes in 5 or 6 years. They haven't increased taxes 8 years since. They said the resources for the city are dwindling. But somebody said, well, a colleague of mine, elected colleague, said, that must have been the toughest decision. I'm like, we hadn't given our employees raises in 5 years.
Yes.
You've got to have resources to grow.
Yes.
But people thought, well, but I knew that the general public, I got 3 angry emails, but 10 people publicly thanked me for doing it because they said our employees needed raises. We need revenues to grow.
Yes.
But I think in order to retain those seats, you've got to get out of the mindset that not letting the tail wag the dog, because generally it's the vocal minority that drives the decision making of typical politicians, but that's not representative of prevailing public opinion.
Yes.
And if you get in that mindset, well, oh, if I do this, I'm going to get 10 angry people blowing up my phone, you're not going to make the decisions in the best interest of the vast majority of the people you serve.
That's exactly right.
So you're right. Maybe I'll set that school up.
I think that would be a very needed service.
And Funk can come work with me too.
Yeah, okay.
So you've written how many books now?
I've written 2 books, and there'll be a third in this series.
So what is your husband doing now?
He basically, after he was not reelected in Kansas City, believe it or not, he was offered many jobs in the Kansas City metropolitan area. He'd be offered it one night, and the next night the offer would be rescinded.
Yeah.
And so we were basically driven out of my children's childhood home. We had to leave Kansas City because he could not get a job there. So he had offers, it had narrowed down to Austin, Texas and Washington, D.C., and there was no way I was going to hot Texas. Yeah. And so he became a publisher of a government journal, one of the only government journals that remained in the United States. But in 2019, they all of a sudden, no notice whatsoever, the guy that owned the journal closed the doors, given every staff member 3 weeks notice. And so my husband has started his own consulting business, doing the same thing he's been doing for his entire career, but, at a, private level.
Yeah. It's funny you should say that. So I'm 8 years out of office. I do leadership coaching, I do keynote speaking, good best-selling book. I do this podcast. But the majority of the stuff that I do is outside of my city. And it's like, so in the bridging movement, I'm on a movement partner with a national nonprofit called Starts With Us. It's focused on getting America away from polarization. Like I can leave the area and it's like everybody listens to what you say, but it's sort of the same thing. I mean, to some degree, if you did things differently, you're kind of a threat to the powers that be. And so I hate to hear that, but that, you guys got someplace you were committed to doing something good, but this is a cautionary tale, I think, for our listeners and for our viewers, to be a true public servant and to do what I generally believe the majority of people in this nation want to see, it comes at a price.
It comes at a very big price. And people ask me all the time if I would do it again, knowing what happened and how difficult it was. And my answer remains the same. Absolutely. Because how many people are given such an opportunity to do so much good for so many people? My only regret is that Funk didn't get to finish what he started, because I think he could have made amazing changes for the regular folks that didn't have a seat at this table, still don't have a seat at the table. And I regret that he didn't finish that. But yes, I think it's an immense privilege, actually, to get a chance to affect change on such a major level.
Well, I will tell you, to you, Gloria, thank you for your service because it's a team effort. And thank you to Funk. And I can't wait to meet him. But we need more people doing that. And it's the same thing with me. And fortunately, I was able to do it for 9 years. But I'm like, I would never change a thing. It was not easy, but I would not change it. And, you put yourself and your family and your friends through a lot because you effectively, and this is what I tell people about, and I'm sure y'all experience this. I'm like, state or national level, you can turn it off. If you're in the state capitol or in Washington, unless you're somebody that's on Meet the Press all the time or the news shows, you can be anonymous. At the local level, when you go to the grocery store, when you go to the gym, you can't get away from the people you serve, which I love that because there is accountability there.
Yes. Being a mayor is in your face 24/7. And really, in my opinion, somebody that's still very apolitical, that's where it all happens, is at the local level like that.
Well, I completely agree. And I'll tell you, just as we get towards the end, but I want to ask you this question because I've made this point to people continually because I think hyperpartisan politics is killing this country. But I'm like, at the local level, in 9 years in office, never once did I get a constituent calling with an issue, ask me my political party, because they just wanted their problem solved.
Yeah.
They didn't really care if I was a Democrat or Republican,
Right.
because being a mayor is about problem solving.
Yes. Or it should be.
Or it should be.
Yes.
Well, as we get towards the ends, where can people find you?
I have a website, which is gloriasquitiro.com, and I'm very active on Facebook. I have a personal Facebook page and an author Facebook page. That's where I'm most active.
Well, cool. Well, my final question is, on a daily basis, what puts a smile on your face and brings joy to your heart?
I always say that if I was a millionaire, it would mean nothing unless I had a close circle of loved ones around me. So people having that true, intimate relationship with others is what drives me.
That is a perfect answer. But once again, Gloria, thank you for your service. Thank you for telling the story. Thank you for sharing with our listeners and viewers today, because people need to know what it takes to be a true public servant. Thank Funk for me. Tell him I can't wait to meet him too.
Okay, I'm sure he's looking forward to it. Thank you for having me on your show.
Absolutely. Well, that is all the time we've got. Dropping the mic, and we are out.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to or watching the Changemaker podcast today. Greatly appreciate it. If you're listening and you want to see the video, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at Deke Copenhaver. That's pretty easy to remember, I would think. But really, we also want to remind you to like, subscribe, rate across all platforms, download. And if you're looking for a coach, a speaker, or anything, you know where to find me. Just email me at me@dekecopenhaver.com. And thanks so much for listening.